Houston in the summertime was a city of extremes. Scorching heat, bustling streets, and secrets hidden in plain sight. Chief Rick Lawson was a man who commanded respect. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a presence that made his officers stand straighter, he had spent the last 2 decades building a spotless reputation. To the outside world, he was the epitome of law and order. Married to the lovely and intelligent Allison Lawson, Rick seemed to have it all: a thriving career, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and a baby on the way. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, the Lawsons' marriage was anything but traditional. Rick and Allison had entered an open marriage, a decision they claimed was made out of mutual understanding. What started as a way to keep things exciting quickly spiraled into something much darker: a web of deceit and forbidden desire. Allison's younger sister, Jessica, was only 25. Vibrant, adventurous, and full of life. She was everything Allison used to be before the wear and tear of a rocky marriage, and her current pregnancy began to weigh her down. Rick had always been close to Jessica, perhaps too close. She had been a part of their lives for years, visiting often, joining them for family dinners, and even helping Allison with baby preparations. But what no one knew was that Rick and Jessica had been meeting in secret for months, their affair growing more intense with every encounter. Jessica had started to talk about a future with Rick, pressing him to leave Allison. But there was a problem: the baby. As long as Allison was pregnant, Rick couldn't bear the idea of leaving her. The public fallout would be catastrophic for his career. He'd spent years cultivating his image as a family man, a beacon of integrity for the Houston Police Department. A divorce would destroy all of it. And so, as the summer heat burned mercilessly, Rick began to devise a plan. The night it all began was deceptively ordinary. Rick and Allison were hosting a backyard barbecue for some friends and colleagues. The smell of sizzling ribs and the sound of clinking beer bottles filled the air. Allison, now 6 months pregnant, moved slower than usual, her hand often resting on her swollen belly. Jessica was there too, dressed in a sundress that flirted with propriety. Her laughter carried across the yard, drawing Rick's attention like a magnet. As the night wore on and guests began to leave, Rick found a moment alone with Jessica by the pool. The soft glow of the underwater lights made her look almost ethereal. "When are you going to stop hiding?" Jessica whispered, her voice low and urgent. "Jessica, this isn't simple," Rick replied, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand what's at stake. I don't care about your career, Rick. I care about us. You said you loved me. Was that a lie?" Rick's gaze darted toward the house where Allison was saying goodbye to the last of their guests. He felt trapped, suffocated by the walls of the life he'd built. "No, it wasn't a lie," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I just need more time." Jessica's eyes hardened. "You've had time. Figure it out, Rick, or I will." In the weeks that followed, Rick's behavior grew increasingly erratic. At work, his usually calm demeanor was replaced by sharp outbursts and uncharacteristic mistakes. His officers whispered about the pressure of impending fatherhood, but no one dared confront him. At home, Allison noticed the change too. She chalked it up to stress, though deep down, she suspected there was more to it. Their open marriage had been her idea, an attempt to save their crumbling relationship, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply it would affect them. Rick had become distant, almost cold. One night, as she was folding baby clothes in the nursery, Allison decided to confront him. "Rick," she began hesitantly, "we need to talk." Rick looked up from the television, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" I feel like you're not here anymore. You're always distracted, always on edge. Is it me? Is it the baby?" Rick sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not you," he said after a long pause. "Work's been tough lately. That's all." But Allison wasn't convinced. She had learned to read between the lines of Rick's carefully measured words. Something was wrong, something far bigger than work. Meanwhile, Jessica was growing impatient. She began calling Rick at all hours, leaving voicemails that teetered between pleading and threatening. One message in particular sent a chill down Rick's spine. "I know you're scared, Rick, but you can't avoid this forever. If you won't do something about Allison, I will." It was then that Rick made his decision. He would have to end it. Not his affair with Jessica, but his marriage to Allison, permanently. Rick began to research. He knew the intricacies of criminal investigations better than most. If anyone could stage the perfect murder, it was him. He started small, testing Allison's medications to see how much she noticed. He reviewed old case files, studying what had gone wrong for others who had tried and failed to get away with murder. Every detail had to be flawless. The day of the crime was unremarkable. It was a Sunday, and Rick had insisted on taking Allison out for a drive to clear their heads. They ended up at a secluded park on the outskirts of the city, a place Rick knew would be deserted at that hour. As they walked along the wooded trail, Rick kept glancing at his watch, his heart pounding. The plan was simple but brutal, a staged mugging gone wrong. He had brought a knife, one that couldn't be traced back to him, and gloves to ensure there would be no fingerprints. "Allison," he said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the trail. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with curiosity and concern. "What is it?" For a moment, Rick hesitated. This was the mother of his unborn child, the woman he had once loved. But then he thought of Jessica, of the life they could have together, and his resolve hardened. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Before Allison could react, Rick lunged. The following morning, Rick called 911 to report his wife missing. His voice was calm, steady, a seasoned officer delivering bad news. He explained how they had been separated during their hike and how he had searched for hours before finally calling for help. The case quickly drew media attention. A pregnant woman, married to a high-ranking police official, vanishing without a trace was headline news. Rick played his part perfectly, appearing distraught during press conferences and pleading for Allison's safe return. But not everyone was convinced. Detective Maria Alvarez, a 15-year veteran of the Houston Police Department, was assigned to the case. From the moment she met Rick, something about his story didn't sit right. His grief seemed rehearsed, his details too polished. Alvarez had seen men like Rick before, men who thought they were smarter than everyone else. She vowed to prove him wrong. The investigation into Allison Lawson's disappearance began swiftly. The media frenzy added pressure on the Houston Police Department to find answers, and as the days passed, the public's concern turned into suspicion. Rick Lawson, though well-respected within the force, was not immune to the scrutiny. Detective Maria Alvarez stood in her small office, staring at a corkboard filled with photographs and timelines. Pictures of Allison, smiling, pregnant, and happy, were pinned alongside a map of the park where Rick claimed she went missing. Something didn't add up. Alvarez's first step was to retrace Allison's last known movements. She visited the park where Rick said they had been hiking. The trail was dense with trees, with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. It was quiet, almost too quiet, for a place Rick described as their go-to spot for relaxing walks. She took her time, scanning the area carefully. As she reached a bend in the trail, she noticed something unusual. A faint smear of blood on a rock near the path caught her eye. It was almost imperceptible, but years of experience had trained Alvarez to notice the smallest details. "Get forensics out here," she barked into her radio. Back at the precinct, Rick was being questioned by two junior detectives. He sat calmly, his hands folded on the table, answering their questions with the precision of someone who had nothing to hide. "When was the last time you saw your wife?" one of them asked. "We were walking on the trail together," Rick replied. "She wanted to stop and take a picture of the sunset. I kept walking ahead. When I turned around, she was gone. I called out for her, searched everywhere, but—" He let his voice trail off, a carefully placed crack of emotion breaking through. The detectives exchanged glances. Rick's story was solid, but something about his demeanor felt rehearsed. Meanwhile, Alvarez was diving deeper into Rick's background. She interviewed friends, family, and colleagues, trying to piece together a clearer picture of the Lawsons' marriage. What she found was surprising. "Allison was complicated," said one of Rick's close friends, sipping his coffee nervously during their conversation. "She had her quirks, but Rick adored her." "Quirks?" Alvarez pressed. "She could be jealous sometimes. Insecure, you know? But she was a good person. They had an unconventional arrangement, though. You know about the open marriage, right?" That detail gave Alvarez pause. It wasn't a crime to have an open marriage, but it did introduce another layer of complexity. She needed to know more about Rick's personal life, especially his relationship with Allison's younger sister Jessica. Jessica had been avoiding Alvarez's calls, which only made the detective more determined to track her down. When Alvarez finally caught up with her, Jessica was sitting in a coffee shop, looking every bit as young and carefree as her photos suggested. "Jessica Taylor?" Alvarez asked, flashing her badge. Jessica's expression faltered for a moment before she forced a polite smile. "That's me. Is this about Allison?" "Yes," Alvarez said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I just have a few questions." Jessica fidgeted with her coffee cup, her nails clicking against the ceramic. "I already told the police everything I know. I don't understand why you need to talk to me again." "Humor me," Alvarez said. "When was the last time you spoke to your sister?" Jessica hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window. "A few days before she went missing. She called me to talk about baby stuff. I was supposed to help her with the nursery next week. Did she mention anything unusual? Arguments? Concerns about Rick?" "No," Jessica said quickly, too quickly. Alvarez leaned back, studying her. Jessica was good at keeping her face neutral, but her body language betrayed her nervousness. "How's your relationship with Rick?" Alvarez asked, her tone casual. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "You seem close. I'm just wondering if there's more to it." Jessica's lips tightened into a thin line. "I don't know what you're implying, but Rick is my brother-in-law. That's it." Back at the station, forensics confirmed that the blood found at the park was a match for Allison. Alvarez knew they were getting closer, but she also knew that physical evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Rick was too smart for that. She decided to dig deeper into his alibi. Rick claimed he had searched the park for hours after Allison went missing, but there were no witnesses to corroborate his story. Alvarez pulled traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, hoping to find something, anything that could prove Rick wasn't where he said he was. What she found made her stomach drop. At 7:45 p.m., just minutes after Rick claimed to have lost sight of Allison, his car was spotted leaving the park. He hadn't stayed to search. He had left. "Gotcha," Alvarez muttered under her breath. The next morning, Alvarez confronted Rick with the footage. She laid the printed images on the interrogation table, her expression impassive. "Care to explain this?" she asked. Rick's eyes narrowed as he studied the photos. "That's me leaving the park," he said finally. "I thought you said you stayed to look for Allison," Alvarez countered. "I did," Rick said smoothly. "I drove around the perimeter, thinking she might have made it to the road. Then I came back." Alvarez raised an eyebrow. "Convenient." "It's the truth," Rick said, his voice steady. But Alvarez wasn't buying it. She had dealt with plenty of liars in her career, and Rick's calm demeanor was beginning to crack under the pressure. Later that day, Alvarez received an anonymous tip. A man claiming to have seen Rick and Jessica together in a secluded motel parking lot weeks before Allison's disappearance called in to share what he knew. "It was weird," the caller said. "They looked real cozy. Didn't seem like just in-laws, if you know what I mean." Armed with this new lead, Alvarez knew she was closing in on the truth. Rick's perfect facade was beginning to crumble, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The anonymous tip had lit a fire under Detective Maria Alvarez. Rick Lawson was no longer just a concerned husband. He was a man with secrets. Alvarez knew that to unravel the truth about Allison's disappearance, she needed to dig deeper into Rick's relationship with Jessica and follow the trail of lies he was weaving. The first stop was the motel mentioned in the tip. Alvarez drove to the quiet, run-down building on the outskirts of Houston. The neon sign flickered overhead as she entered the lobby. Behind the desk sat a middle-aged man in a stained t-shirt, lazily flipping through a magazine. "Detective Alvarez, Houston PD," she said, flashing her badge. "I need to see your records for the past 2 months." The man sighed. "You cops always come in asking for favors. You got a warrant?" Alvarez smirked. "Not yet, but I can get one. Or you can save me the paperwork and show me what I need." The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine, but make it quick." Alvarez scanned the guest log, her eyes narrowing when she saw Rick Lawson's name. He had checked in under a pseudonym but used his credit card. Sloppy for someone who was usually so meticulous. "Did you see him with anyone?" she asked the clerk. "Yeah," the man said, scratching his beard. "Young girl, brunette. They came in a couple of times. Always asked for the same room." Room number? Room 7 was small and unremarkable, with faded wallpaper and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. Alvarez called in a forensics team to dust for prints and search for anything that might tie Rick and Jessica to the room. A few hours later, the team hit pay dirt, strands of hair matching Jessica's DNA and a lipstick-stained coffee cup. The evidence wasn't damning on its own, but it painted a picture of an affair that was becoming harder for Rick to deny. Alvarez decided it was time to press Jessica again. This time, she brought her into the station for a formal interview. Jessica sat nervously in the interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Jessica," Alvarez began, her tone firm but not unkind. "We have evidence that you and Rick were involved romantically. We know about the motel. This is your chance to come clean." Jessica's face flushed red. "That's not true," she blurted. "Rick is my brother-in-law. He loves my sister." "Then why were you meeting him in secret?" Alvarez pressed. Jessica bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. I I don't know what you're talking about." Alvarez leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Listen, Jessica, I get it. Rick is charming, and he probably made a lot of promises. But if you're protecting him, you're only hurting yourself. Allison is missing, and we need the truth." For a moment, Jessica seemed like she might crack. Her lips parted, and she drew in a shaky breath, but then she shook her head. "I don't know anything," she said, her voice barely audible. While Jessica was being questioned, Alvarez continued to piece together Rick's movements on the night of Allison's disappearance. She obtained his phone records and noticed a series of calls to Jessica just hours before Allison was reported missing. "Why would you need to talk to your sister-in-law so urgently that night?" Alvarez muttered to herself. The phone records also revealed something even more chilling: a call to a local construction site. The site had been abandoned for weeks, but Alvarez knew it could be the key to solving the case. The next morning, Alvarez visited the site with a search team. The skeletal framework of a half-built building loomed against the gray sky. The area was littered with debris, cement bags, steel rods, and piles of dirt. "Spread out," Alvarez instructed her team. "We're looking for anything unusual." Hours passed with no leads, but then one of the officers shouted, "Detective! Over here!" Alvarez jogged over to find the officer standing near a freshly disturbed patch of soil. Her heart sank as she saw what he was pointing at: a small patch of fabric sticking out of the ground. "Get the cadaver dogs," she ordered. It didn't take long for the dogs to alert to the spot. As the team began digging, Alvarez's worst fears were confirmed. Buried beneath the soil was a body, wrapped in a tarp. The coroner's report later identified the remains as Allison Lawson. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and there were signs of strangulation. The medical examiner also confirmed that she was still pregnant at the time of her death. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. Alvarez now had proof that Allison's disappearance was no accident. It was murder, and all signs pointed to Rick Lawson. Alvarez brought Rick in for questioning again, this time armed with the evidence from the construction site. She placed the photos of Allison's body on the table in front of him. "Care to explain this?" she asked coldly. Rick's face remained expressionless, but Alvarez noticed the slightest twitch in his jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "We found your wife's body, Rick, buried at a construction site. You're telling me you have no idea how she got there?" "I'm telling you I didn't kill her," Rick said, his voice rising. "I loved Allison. Then why did you leave the park that night? Why were you calling Jessica? And why were you at that motel with her weeks before Allison went missing?" Rick opened his mouth to respond, but Alvarez cut him off. "You're a liar," she said. "We have your prints, your phone records, and witnesses who saw you with Jessica. The only question now is whether you want to go down for this alone, or if you're going to drag her down with you." Rick's calm exterior finally cracked. His hands clenched into fists, and his face turned red, but he still said nothing. Later, Alvarez sat in her office, staring at the case file. She knew Rick was guilty, but she needed more to lock him away for good, and she wasn't going to stop until she found it. The case was heating up, and Detective Maria Alvarez could feel the pressure mounting. With Allison Lawson's body discovered and Rick Lawson's web of lies unraveling, the stakes had never been higher. But Alvarez still needed concrete evidence to tie Rick to the murder, evidence that would hold up in court. The first step was to shatter Rick's carefully crafted alibi. Alvarez knew he had been at the park with Allison the night she disappeared, but his claim of leaving to grab a coffee while Allison stayed behind didn't sit right. She retraced Rick's steps, starting with the coffee shop he claimed to have visited. The barista on duty that night, a young woman with dyed pink hair, squinted at the photo of Rick Alvarez presented. "Yeah, I remember him," the barista said. "Came in around 8:30 or so. Ordered a black coffee to go." "Did he seem in a rush?" Alvarez asked. The barista shrugged. "Not really. He hung around for a while, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. "And you're sure it was that night?" "Positive. He paid with a card, and the system keeps a record." Alvarez thanked the barista and asked for the receipt. The timestamp on it read 8:42 p.m. It matched Rick's story, but Alvarez wasn't satisfied. Something felt off. Next, she reviewed surveillance footage from the parking lot outside the coffee shop. Rick's car was visible in the footage, pulling into a spot at 8:33 p.m. and leaving at 8:48 p.m. But what Alvarez noticed next made her stomach drop. At 8:50 p.m., Rick's car was caught on another surveillance camera just a few blocks away, at a gas station. Alvarez obtained the footage from the gas station, and sure enough, there was Rick standing by his car, scrubbing something off the trunk with a cloth. "What are you hiding, Rick?" Alvarez muttered under her breath. Alvarez confronted Rick with the gas station footage during a second interrogation. She slid the still images across the table. "This is you, isn't it? Cleaning your car at a gas station just minutes after you left the coffee shop." Rick's face paled, but he quickly recovered. "I was just cleaning off some bird droppings," he said with a shrug. "No big deal." "Bird droppings?" Alvarez raised an eyebrow. "You expect me to believe that, on the same night your wife disappeared, you were more concerned about the cleanliness of your car than finding her?" Rick folded his arms. "I don't see how this proves anything. It proves you're lying," Alvarez snapped. "You weren't looking for Allison. You were covering your tracks." Rick leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You've got nothing on me." Frustrated but undeterred, Alvarez turned her attention to the murder weapon. The autopsy revealed that Allison had suffered blunt force trauma, likely from a heavy object. Alvarez suspected the weapon was something Rick had easy access to, perhaps even something from his own home. She obtained a warrant to search Rick's house and garage. The search was exhaustive, with officers combing through every inch of the property. Finally, in the corner of the garage, Alvarez spotted a crowbar with faint traces of what looked like blood. "Bag it," she instructed the forensics team. The crowbar was sent to the lab for analysis. When the results came back, they confirmed Alvarez's suspicions. The blood on the crowbar was a match for Allison's DNA. With the crowbar in evidence and Rick's alibi in shambles, Alvarez was ready to bring Jessica back in for questioning. This time she played hardball. "Jessica, we found the weapon Rick used to kill Allison," Alvarez said, placing the photo of the blood-stained crowbar in front of her. "And we know you were involved." Jessica's eyes widened in horror. "I didn't do anything, I swear." "Maybe not," Alvarez said, leaning closer. "But you knew what Rick was planning, didn't you?" "You knew, and you didn't stop him." Jessica burst into tears. "He said he loved me," she sobbed. "He said we could be together, but only if Allison was out of the picture. I didn't think he'd actually—" She broke off, covering her face with her hands. "You need to tell me everything," Alvarez said firmly. "If you cooperate, the DA might go easier on you. But if you keep protecting Rick, you'll go down for this too." Jessica hesitated, her tears falling silently onto the table. Finally, she nodded. "I'll tell you everything," she whispered. Jessica's confession was the final nail in Rick's coffin. She admitted that Rick had planned the murder for weeks, luring Allison to the park under the guise of a romantic evening. He had convinced Jessica to stay silent, promising her a life together once Allison was gone. Alvarez took the case to the district attorney, who wasted no time filing charges against Rick for first-degree murder. Jessica was charged as an accessory but agreed to testify against Rick in exchange for a reduced sentence. As Rick Lawson was led away in handcuffs, Detective Alvarez felt a sense of relief. Justice for Allison had been served. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and curious onlookers as the trial of Rick Lawson began. It was a case that had gripped Houston, a high-ranking police chief accused of brutally murdering his pregnant wife to be with her younger sister. Detective Maria Alvarez sat in the gallery, her presence a silent reminder of the relentless investigation that had led to this moment. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Claire Weston, wasted no time painting Rick as a manipulative and calculating man who believed his position of power made him untouchable. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Weston began in her opening statement, this is not just a case of murder. This is a case of betrayal, of cold, calculated evil. Rick Lawson, a man sworn to protect and serve, took the life of his wife, Allison Lawson, and their unborn child, all for the sake of lust and greed. Weston laid out the evidence, the gas station footage, the crowbar with Allison's blood, and Jessica's damning testimony. She emphasized Rick's motive, his desire to start a new life with Jessica without the complications of a divorce or a custody battle over the baby. Rick's defense attorney, Mark Trent, countered by painting Rick as a loving husband who had been framed by circumstantial evidence and an unreliable witness. Detective Alvarez has done an admirable job, Trent admitted, but even the best detectives can be wrong. My client is a victim of a rush to judgment, fueled by media hysteria and an overzealous investigation. The first few days of the trial were dominated by forensic experts. The prosecution called the medical examiner to testify about the cause of death. Dr. Sandra Patel described the brutal nature of Allison's injuries, her voice steady as she detailed the trauma to the jury. Based on the angle and force of the blows, Dr. Patel explained, it is clear that the attack was deliberate and not an accident. Next, the forensic analyst who tested the crowbar took the stand. She confirmed that the blood and hair samples on the weapon matched Allison's DNA, leaving no doubt that it was the murder weapon. Trent tried to poke holes in the forensic evidence, questioning the chain of custody and suggesting that the evidence could have been contaminated. But the prosecution's witnesses remained firm under cross-examination, their testimonies rock solid. The most explosive moment came when Jessica Lawson took the stand. Dressed conservatively, her face pale and drawn, Jessica avoided looking at Rick as she recounted the events leading up to Allison's murder. Rick told me he couldn't live without me, she said, her voice trembling. He said Allison was standing in the way of our happiness. I didn't think he'd actually kill her. Weston guided Jessica through her confession, carefully laying out the timeline of events. Jessica admitted that Rick had confided in her about his plan to stage Allison's disappearance as a random abduction. He said he'd make it look like she was taken from the park, Jessica said. I begged him not to do it, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was the only way we could be together. When it was Trent's turn to cross-examine, he went on the offensive, trying to discredit Jessica's testimony. You admit that you were having an affair with my client, Trent said. Isn't it true that you were jealous of your sister and wanted her out of the picture? No, Jessica exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. I love my sister. I never wanted her to die. But you kept quiet, Trent pressed. You didn't go to the police. You didn't stop him. Isn't it possible that you're making this up to save yourself? Jessica broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do, she cried. I was scared. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Detective Alvarez was the final witness for the prosecution. She walked the jury through the investigation, detailing how each piece of evidence pointed back to Rick. She described the anonymous tip that led her to the motel, the gas station footage, and the discovery of Allison's body. Rick Lawson thought he could outsmart us, Alvarez said. He thought his position as police chief would protect him, but no one is above the law. During cross-examination, Trent tried to paint Alvarez as biased and overzealous. You were under a lot of pressure to solve this case, Trent said. Isn't it possible that you jumped to conclusions because Rick Lawson was an easy target? I don't jump to conclusions, Alvarez replied coolly. I follow the evidence, and the evidence led me to Rick Lawson. As the trial progressed, the jury was shown the surveillance footage, photos of the crime scene, and excerpts from Rick's phone records. Weston hammered home the timeline, showing how Rick's actions on the night of the murder were anything but innocent. Trent did his best to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The jury could see through his attempts to deflect blame, and Rick's smug demeanor didn't help his cause. In her closing arguments, Weston appealed to the jury's sense of justice. Allison Lawson was a daughter, a sister, and a mother-to-be, she said, her voice filled with emotion. She deserved to live. She deserved to see her child grow up. Rick Lawson took that away from her, and he must be held accountable. Trent, on the other hand, begged the jury to consider the possibility of doubt. My client is not a perfect man, he admitted, but imperfection is not a crime. The prosecution has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Rick Lawson committed this heinous act. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as they returned with their verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Lawson, guilty of first-degree murder. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of approval. Rick slumped in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. Outside the courthouse, Alvarez watched as Allison's family embraced each other, their tears a mixture of grief and relief. Justice had been served, but the scars of the case would linger for a long time. For Alvarez, the case was a reminder of why she had become a detective, to speak for the voiceless and ensure that no one, not even a police chief, was above the law. The guilty verdict marked a victory for justice, but for Detective Maria Alvarez, the case didn't end in the courtroom. The aftermath of Rick Lawson's conviction brought with it a flood of questions, scrutiny, and unexpected revelations that threatened to unravel everything Alvarez thought she knew about the murder. The Houston Police Department launched an internal review into Rick Lawson's tenure as chief. Alvarez had her suspicions about his misconduct, but the depth of his corruption shocked even her. Investigators discovered that Rick had used his position to manipulate cases, intimidate witnesses, and cover up questionable actions for years. His colleagues, once loyal to him, began coming forward with stories of his abuse of power. One of the most damning discoveries was a series of emails between Rick and a private investigator he had hired months before Allison's murder. The emails revealed that Rick had been spying on Allison, tracking her movements and conversations. It became clear that his obsession with control extended far beyond his professional life. Alvarez wasn't surprised when the media got wind of these revelations. Headlines screamed about the disgraced police chief who had abused his power to orchestrate his wife's murder. The public demanded accountability, not just from Rick, but from the entire department for allowing him to operate unchecked for so long. For Alvarez, the backlash was personal. She had worked tirelessly to bring Rick to justice, but now her own department was under fire. Some of her colleagues began to treat her differently, resenting her for exposing the corruption that had tainted their reputation. Alvarez tried to brush it off, focusing instead on tying up loose ends in the case. One loose end was Jessica Lawson. Although she had cooperated with the prosecution, Alvarez couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica knew more than she had let on. After the trial, Alvarez visited Jessica, who was staying at a halfway house while awaiting sentencing. "Jessica, I need the whole truth," Alvarez said, sitting across from her in the sterile interview room. "If there's anything you're still hiding, now's the time to come clean." Jessica hesitated, her hands trembling in her lap. "I told you everything I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You told me what Rick planned, but what about before that?" Alvarez pressed. "Did you and Rick ever talk about alternatives?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "He talked about divorce," she admitted, "but he said it would ruin him. He said Allison would take everything, his money, his reputation, his career. He couldn't let that happen. Did he ever mention the baby?" Jessica nodded, her tears spilling over. "He hated that she was pregnant. He said the baby would make things even messier. I didn't want to believe he was serious about hurting her, but I should have seen it coming." Jessica's confession led Alvarez to revisit Rick's financial records. What she found added another layer to the case. Rick had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Allison just months before her death, an amount that would have easily covered any losses from a divorce. Alvarez shared the discovery with Assistant District Attorney Claire Weston, who used it to push for a harsher sentence for Jessica. "She may not have killed Allison herself, but she knew what Rick was planning," Weston argued in court, "and she chose to do nothing." In the end, Jessica was sentenced to 5 years in prison for being an accessory to murder. It wasn't the justice Alvarez had hoped for, but it was something. As the dust settled, Alvarez began to reflect on the case and its impact on her own life. She had dedicated months to uncovering the truth, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and her own peace of mind. The images of Allison's battered body and the devastated faces of her family haunted her. One night, Alvarez found herself staring at a photo of Allison and Jessica from years ago. They were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other. The picture was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Not just Allison's life, but the bond between two sisters torn apart by greed and betrayal. Alvarez wondered if she could have done more to prevent the tragedy. Could she have acted faster? Was there something she had missed? The questions lingered unanswered. In an effort to find closure, Alvarez visited Allison's parents. The elderly couple had become like family to her over the course of the investigation, and she wanted to offer them some semblance of peace. "Detective Alvarez," Mrs. Carter said, her voice trembling with emotion, "we can't thank you enough for what you've done. You gave Allison a voice when she couldn't speak for herself." "I just wish I could have done more," Alvarez replied. "You brought us justice," Mr. Carter said firmly. "That's more than we ever thought we'd get." The visit reminded Alvarez why she had chosen this path, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Meanwhile, the Houston Police Department began implementing reforms to prevent another Rick Lawson from rising to power. Alvarez was asked to lead a task force focused on accountability and transparency within the department. It was a daunting challenge, but Alvarez accepted, determined to turn the tragedy into an opportunity for change. As Alvarez drove home that night, she couldn't help but think about Allison. She had been a victim of unimaginable betrayal, but her story had sparked a reckoning in the city of Houston. For Alvarez, that was the true victory, not just bringing Rick to justice, but ensuring that no one else would suffer the way Allison had. She looked out at the city lights, feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. The case had taken its toll, but it had also reaffirmed her purpose. No matter how dark the road became, Alvarez would keep fighting for justice. The courtroom had been emptied, the headlines had faded, and the city of Houston was slowly moving forward. But for Detective Maria Alvarez, the case was far from forgotten. Rick Lawson's conviction had set the stage for sweeping changes in the police department and in the community. Still, the scars left behind by Allison's murder lingered, refusing to fully heal. Months after Rick Lawson's sentencing, Alvarez sat in her cramped office, the dim glow of her desk lamp illuminating stacks of case files. She had been promoted to lieutenant, her work on the Lawson case earning her the respect and trust of her peers and superiors. Despite her new responsibilities, she remained tethered to Allison's case, poring over every detail one last time. Closure felt elusive, but she knew it was time to let go. She placed the final file into a box labeled "Closed Cases" and leaned back in her chair. The image of Allison's smiling face flashed in her mind. "Rest easy now," she whispered. Meanwhile, the Houston Police Department underwent a transformation. The reforms Alvarez had helped spearhead were being implemented, including stricter oversight of high-ranking officers and mandatory ethics training. A whistleblower hotline was established, giving officers a safe avenue to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The department's public relations team worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the community. Town hall meetings were held, and citizens were invited to share their concerns directly with law enforcement. Alvarez often attended these meetings, listening intently and answering questions. She knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but each conversation felt like a step in the right direction. Jessica Lawson's sentencing had brought mixed reactions. Some believed her punishment was too lenient, while others argued that she had been manipulated by Rick. Jessica herself seemed to accept her fate, using her time in prison to reflect on her actions. Alvarez received a handwritten letter from her, delivered through a prison official. "Detective Alvarez," the letter began, "I don't expect your forgiveness, but I wanted to thank you for uncovering the truth. Rick was a monster, and I was too blind to see it. I'll carry the guilt of my choices for the rest of my life. I only hope that one day I can make amends for the pain I've caused." Alvarez folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't know if she could forgive Jessica, but she appreciated the gesture. The Carter family had relocated to a quieter part of Texas, hoping to escape the painful memories of Houston. Before they left, Alvarez visited them one final time. Allison's mother, frail but resolute, handed Alvarez a small wrapped package. "This belonged to Allison," she said. "We want you to have it." Alvarez hesitated but accepted the gift. Inside was a simple silver locket, engraved with the words, "Forever in my heart." Inside the locket was a photo of Allison and her unborn child's ultrasound image. Tears welled in Alvarez's eyes as she clasped it around her neck. "She would have wanted you to have it," Mrs. Carter said softly. "You gave her justice." Despite the progress, Alvarez couldn't ignore the personal toll the case had taken on her. Sleepless nights, strained relationships, and a lingering sense of guilt had left her feeling disconnected from her own life. Her closest friend, Detective Lauren Perez, urged her to take a break. "You can't save everyone, Maria," Lauren said over drinks one evening. "You've done more than most people could ever hope to, but you need to take care of yourself too." Alvarez nodded, knowing Lauren was right. She decided to take a 2-week vacation, a rarity in her line of work. She packed a bag and drove to a small cabin in the Texas Hill Country, seeking solace in the tranquility of nature. During her time away, Alvarez reflected on her career and the choices that had led her to this point. She thought about Allison, Jessica, Rick, and all the lives that had been impacted by the case. She realized that justice wasn't just about solving crimes. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless and standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. On her last day at the cabin, Alvarez took a long hike through the hills. She reached a quiet overlook and stood there for a while, feeling the breeze on her face. She took the locket from around her neck and held it tightly. "I'll never forget you, Allison," she said aloud, "but it's time for me to move forward." Returning to Houston, Alvarez felt a renewed sense of purpose. She threw herself into her work, mentoring younger officers and pushing for more reforms. She also began volunteering with a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence, a cause she had grown passionate about during the Lawson investigation. The organization's founder, a survivor herself, welcomed Alvarez with open arms.